Hello, everybody, and welcome to the last of a six-part series diving into the different elements of me at my best. Today, we're going to be talking about community well-being, and we have a fabulous guest here, Charles Vogl. You're going to hear more about him in just a moment. But in the meantime, I would love to hear from our audience where you're coming from. So go ahead and write in the chat where you're coming from so we can kind of get a sense of where everybody is. So Charles, welcome. Nice to have you.
I'm so delighted to be here and talk about things that I think are important.
Well, I can't think of anybody better to talk to about community well-being. And I feel so lucky that I not only have gotten to know your work, but I've really gotten to know you as a human being over the course of the last year. So you and I have been part of a campfire group, and we're going to talk more about that in just a moment, and obviously the role that you've played in that. So you are someone who's been teaching leaders the wisdom and principles to build not just community, but deep community, and really steeped in around resilient relationships. I love this idea of resilient relationships so that we can change lives and change the world. And this includes advising some of the most influential organizations such as Google. And we're going to be talking about the work that you've been doing with Google. You are also the author of multiple books, including The Art of Community and a follow-up to that, Building Brand Communities. So welcome. So nice to have you.
I'm so happy to talk about these things.
So let's start first with hearing about, how would you define community well-being? What is that when you hear this kind of thrown out there? How would you define what it actually is?
Well, in my work, Laura, I use a very specific term for community, and that is a group of people who share mutual concern for one another. And the reason it's important to say that is we're in a time where I've noticed that many people consider a list of people a community, a list of people who clicked on something, a list of people they have their emails. Nothing wrong with lists, Laura, and I'm part of a lot of lists, but that's not a community. If we're going to get to community, we have to invest differently, which almost always means more, to actually generate those relationships that when knitted together, those relationships of mutual care, when knitted together, create a community. So when you say what makes a healthy community, what I'm looking for are relationships where people within it know that other people in that community care about them. And very often communities are newly identified when someone has a tragedy. And all of a sudden people start showing up to help. And it's unfortunate when people who have the tragedy are surprised when people are helping, because it wouldn't have been great to know that those people were ready to help before. But that's when we can recognize, oh, wow, there's real community here. And a great example that comes to mind is book groups. Someone thinks they joined a book group to learn about books. And well within a year, what they find out is that the books really don't matter that much about those relationships. And if somebody gets a bad diagnosis, everybody in the book group shows up, but they don't really care what book they're reading.
Yeah, it is. I think sometimes we're accidental tourists in communities that we thought we would never be part of. I know, for example, over 15 years ago, my father was diagnosed with a disease called Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, more popularly known as mad cow disease. And as you might imagine, I was suddenly part of a community that I never thought I would be part of. And so that tragedy and the loss of him has really also helped me to be part of a community that I might not have been otherwise. So I want to hear a little bit more, Charles, about this campfire idea. And just, a lot of times when we think about community, we think of a giant platform, social media platform that's often called a community, but it's not really a community. Or we might think of it in terms of where we live, our neighborhood, that's our community. Or I live in San Francisco, that's my community. But I know that you really think about it more on a smaller level when you think about community. And I think that Campfire really embodies that. So tell us a little bit about this campfire. I've been lucky enough to be part of it over the course of this last year. This is hosted by Google, but you are the architect behind this idea of these campfires. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay, well, let me just clarify. I think that there can be a community in a city and there can be a community on a large platform. For example, a brand like CrossFit, there are tens of thousands of CrossFitters, and I think there's a genuine community there. Um, because I think there can be mutual concern within a city or say a large brand community like CrossFit. When you say that I think smaller, I think what you're referring to is this idea that it's counterintuitive for many people. And it may be even counterintuitive in our culture that wants to go big digitally, quickly on everything. That when we think about strong community, we have to think small. That when you think, Laura, of all the communities of the you feel welcomed, you feel safe, that you believe, hopefully accurately, that they'll show up when you need help. Usually, if not, in fact, every time, those relationships were formed in what we call an intimate experience. An experience of a conversation that usually happens with less than 10 people, usually less than 5 people, in a space that has certain criteria. One of them is you have the freedom to talk about what you want to talk about, i.e., you're not just showing up and participating in someone's agenda. All the distractions that might pull you away have been handled. So you're probably not having those conversations underneath the television with a sports game going on and lots of advertisements. And lastly, you're physically close enough or in a space small enough, if it's a digital space, where you can be vulnerable and choose who hears what.
I think that this campfire is kind of a nice model for how other organizations might build more community. And there are some really kind of standard elements to this that I have come to expect every time. So one is that it meets regularly. It's every Friday at 1:30. So I know to expect that. Another is that we have rituals, and particularly the one where we have a moment of silence for 60 seconds. And just how that kind of brings all of us to a place where we're ready to go a little bit deeper. So it's not just we meet once a week, but it's really that we meet in a more intentional way. And then also having a prompt that we may or may not follow, but it's a way to kind of guide our conversation. So thinking about that and what you've created at Google around that, using this tool of the campfire, tell us about what other organizations might think about doing so that they can do the same.
Well, what Google and the project that we're on what Google's embraced in the project we're on is this understanding that to get the relationships we all aspire to create, we need to create these more intimate settings, and we need to physically schedule the time to do that. And if we're always thinking what are big events with someone on stage or what information are we piping out to people on a list, we're never going to get to those relationships. So when other organizations want to emulate that, we can look at a few things. One is, when are you scheduling the time? Do your people or the people who want to connect more? Because quite frankly, as a workforce, we're really, really lonely and isolated and burned out. When do they have the time to have those conversations that are not agenda driven, but they can invest in relationships, much like when you sit around a campfire in the evening, which is why we call them campfire events, because most people experience that and realize, oh yeah, that was fun and it was helpful in connecting. So one is, look at where is the time. If the time's not there, don't be surprised that people are isolated and connected and burned out as a consequence. Second, when we make the invitation to join, and there needs to be an invitation to join, not an announcement that says, hey, we're doing this thing, but invitation, Laura, we'd love for you to join for this reason, make sure that that intention is clear. Otherwise, it's just another task to be done, and it doesn't provide space for the conversations to show up that allow people to connect, that typically lead to participants understand they're being seen for who they really are, and then they can see whether they're accepted for who they really are. When we're accomplishing agenda, we're just getting the next thing done.
So tell us a little bit more about kind of the difference that you've seen in the work that you've been doing with Google around community. And I've been getting to be part of this through the Google Vitality Lab, again, hosted by Google, but you've really been taking a lead role in advising them in creating this structure. So what are some of the differences that you've seen as a result of it?
Differences, you mean what kind of feedback are we getting from participants?
Yeah.
Well, I must say, when we started this project, we were envisioning it in 2019. And then it was in March and 20 that we all entered the pandemic era. And so we were surprised by what we were going to do because we had to change our plans. And then, of course, by virtue of that, we were surprised about how people participated because nobody envisioned this participation. Everything went digital. And in the best way possible, we were shocked that even though all of our programming for the Vitality Lab went digital, we had several participants tell us that they felt that the other participants they were participating with felt like family. Mm-hmm. In fact, we had at least 2 participants say, I consider you all my professional family now. And I thought that was a profound outcome because we can't force that, right? We can only make an invitation. We can create a space. We can make sure that when people show up, there's some kind of leadership there, that it's not just an empty video room. But for others to show up in a way where they feel so seen that they call the other members family is extraordinary. And we're hoping that this can be a role model program to many, at least tech companies, because the research is pretty clear that the tech workforce is extremely isolated and lonely. And then if other companies want to take it seriously, these are principles that can be rolled out, quite frankly, anywhere that someone has the intention and the time.
So I want to dive a little bit more into this loneliness idea. And an earlier guest, Smiley Poswalski, characterizes it as the age of loneliness. Mm-hmm. And the first question that I have for the audience is, are you experiencing loneliness? Have you seen more evidence of loneliness in the people that you know, in your workplace, in your teams? But thinking about this idea of creating these structures and the more intimate structures as you're describing, Charles, how do we actually, I mean, what's happening around loneliness, and how do we actually tackle this in a meaningful way?
Well, I'm so glad you asked. We know that people are lonely. And so for those who are listening right now and you're feeling lonely, you are normal, unfortunately. We know that at least half Americans report they're feeling lonely when surveyed, and those are just the people reporting it. Mm-hmm. This is probably, if not absolutely certainly, the loneliest era of people's history. In fact,
our current, just interrupt you, we're lonelier than we've ever been, mm-hmm. but more connected than we've ever been. So digital I often think of the title of the book called Alone Together, mm-hmm. which is more connected than ever through our devices, and mm-hmm. yet more alone than ever. So back to you.
Well, Laura, digital connection does a fantastic job putting us in touch with thousands or hundreds of thousands of people who don't care that much about us. It largely does a lousy job connecting us with people where we grow relationships, where we really care about one another and show up. And I'll give you an example. On one social media platform, at one point, I had 1,500 friends using the nomenclature of that platform. But when I moved across the country, less than 700 people came to help me move. Wow. Actually, it was less than 20, right? Which is to say that number 1,500 was meaningless when it really came time for me to move, and it would be great if friends helped me load the truck.
You know, I think what you've described to me community as being those people, those friends that you can call at 3:00 in the morning. Mm-hmm. How many of those do you actually have?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the ideas I like to share is that all of us want, and the world would be better when we have friends that when we have an emergency at 3 a.m., we know they want the phone call. Yeah. And hopefully for both you and me, there are people in our lives that if their house starts flooding at 3 a.m. and they don't call us and we're close enough that we can help, that's a problem for us because they rob us of the opportunity to be the friend we want to be. Yeah. So one of the things we can look at when we look at, well, how do we want to go about approaching loneliness? And so, well, how can we generate and help others generate more 3 a.m. friends? And I'm not talking about 100. I'm not talking about 50. I'm talking like 3. Yeah. If someone doesn't have 3 and then they get to 3 and then we can help them get to 6 by understanding the principles of community, that's life-changing. And Laura, if you and I lived a life where everyone we talk to has 6 people that they know they can call at 3 a.m. in emergency, everything would be different.
It really would be completely different. And I have to say, Charles, you're one of my 3 a.m. friends now. And I hope that you perceive me as being that for you. And that came through a structure, an intentional structure, which I think is so interesting. I want to pause to just share a couple of the comments that have come in. So Lana is sharing, it is real within my workplace at NASA. Most employees are still working remotely. We are just starting to approach this social emotional aspect. And Kelly writes, interestingly enough, I'm seeing that loneliness is coming within some of my established campfire circles due to such polarizing ideals in the past 18 months. Yes, I mean, I don't think we've ever seen this kind of division, at least, in my lifetime, I've never seen this kind of division. The communities that share so many of my values can sometimes suddenly leave me lonely depending on the topic that comes up. And then Crockett writes here, I would take a call from Laura and help her move. Thank you, Crockett. So can you speak to some of those comments that have come in, Charles?
Yes, we are in a scary, polarizing time. And there is not an easy answer or solution, because if there was, you would have it, you'd have downloaded it, you'd be using it. Fortunately or unfortunately, I think one way we need to consider how to approach this is not easy. It is, however, old. And that is, we have to grow empathy. And growing empathy often means spending the time to learn what others are dealing with, what scares them, what they aspire to, and then recognizing where we can recognize ourselves in them or in their situation. And to be fair, it may appear there's not very much. And to do this, we have to invest. And it might be investing in conversations that we, at certainly the beginning, like to avoid. And we can recognize this is the road, right? No surprise, no other way. And
I think this idea of empathy is really interesting. And, can we actually teach it? Or can it only be developed through experience? There was an organization that's fascinating. They were trying to teach kids empathy. And the way they did this was with a second grade class. Is they brought a baby in at the beginning of the year, and they would bring that same baby in on a regular basis as a way to teach empathy, but it was very much of kind of experiential. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about, how do we meaningfully really teach empathy so that people can connect on that deeper level?
Well, I'm not an expert on teaching empathy. I do study faith traditions, as you know. And one of the things that we see as a through line in established wisdom traditions is this understanding that we have to understand the story, or said differently, the experience of other people. And that's even when we don't necessarily want to go out of our way to learn that. So that's where storytelling becomes very, very important. And if you think of how much of the world you think you know, Laura, and I'm not questioning whether you know it, much of that came from looking at media, documentary films specifically. And all those people who made any documentary films that are worth doing were telling you a story. Just to recognize that taking the time to understand someone's story helps us lead to understanding that empathy. And when we're talking about working with coworkers or neighbors or people in our spiritual communities that we'd best like to avoid, we can notice where are we taking that time to learn their stories. And if we don't want to do it, can we find the humility and patience in ourselves to do that? And we might not like what we hear, right? But that's the road. And you're right, loneliness is record-breaking. Our current Surgeon General wrote an entire book about the loneliness epidemic. Now, I don't know what's a bigger red flag than when the top doctor in the nation sits down to write a book about the subject. And unfortunately, it's getting worse. I'm actually really pessimistic about where not only the country, but the world is going regarding our isolation. And I am optimistic about the difference individuals can make when we recognize this context and teach ourselves tools, principles, and even a lens on relationships that help us to connect the people we care about around us. Because when you're living in a desert of loneliness, it doesn't take a very big hose to make a profound difference to the people around you.
I think it's so interesting, Charles, kind of this toggling back and forth between what can we do as individuals to boost our community well-being, to tackle this rising tide of loneliness, but also recognizing just how much this has to also be a collective effort. And I want to pause really quickly. Chris Schaefer, our wonderful mutual friend here, she wrote, you two know that I'm your 3 a.m. friend. Thank you so much, Chris. And Chris is a mentor of mine. So nice to hear those connections. So talk a little bit about that, Charles, if you would, about that tension between, in the field of wellness. There is so much advice out there and, so much stuff around individual habit formation. The key to becoming your best self is if you just buckle down and improve your habits. But it's a bigger conversation. So can you talk a little bit about
it? It is.
that
I'm glad you brought it up because when people turn to experts to help, often it's about what can I do individually today, and there are things we can do, right? And we can talk about those later in this call if you ask Laura. We also need to acknowledge that it's not an accident that half of the country reports we're lonely, that we're living in a time where people are working more, they're earning less. My understanding is even pre-pandemic, 8 out of 10 Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. Well, if we're busy just trying to keep up with our needs, there isn't time for us to have the conversations, to spend the moments that generate the relationships where we feel supportive enough and connected enough that at 3 a.m. we can call for help. I've worked with people in the military talking about challenges the military has. And part of the problem is many soldiers are so busy with training and responsibilities, and let's call it what it is, 20 years of war, that they don't have the time to build the relationships that could be really supportive and knit together a community of soldiers. So even there, in a very, very structured place where people have shared training and a shared mission, even there, we're seeing an erosion of these kind of connections that we had a generation ago. Another issue that's come up in the last generation is Americans are largely running away from their home faith traditions. Unfortunately, often for very good reasons. Nonetheless, we could acknowledge that Americans aren't coming together about once a week with people with shared values and shared purpose, enacting rituals, and acknowledging over a lifetime how we're maturing with people who are seeing us regularly. That's not a call for Americans to go back to faith traditions that they want to run away from, but an acknowledgement that this landscape has changed. And if you or your friends are noticing that you're feeling more isolated, it's because the culture is isolating us more. And I don't have an easy solution on how to handle that, but we can all be in the conversation. Where can we provide room in workers' lives, in parents' lives, in soldiers' lives, where we just have the room to create the connections that makes our culture work?
I think that so often we tend to blame ourselves, and it's not to say, as you just spoke to, that there aren't things that we can't do as individuals, but as you characterize it, it's not an accident that half of Americans are lonely, and it has to do with much bigger trends, like the number of people, as you talked about, are working more, earning less, but also the reduction in these kind of faith-based networks. It's interesting in my, circling back to my father's side of the family is actually Quaker. And I found that having that Quaker-based service after he passed away was so healing. Even though I don't really consider myself religious at all, it was that community, that deep community that goes back generations for me, that really kind of helped me in my healing path forward. And so, and there's Blue Zones research showing that people who are part of a faith-based community are likely to live 4 years longer. So kind of interesting that the connection there. So if you were to talk about, we know that it's not an accident that here we are, and that it's a much bigger conversation. What would you say is the top thing that an organization might think about doing, or a leader at an organization might think about doing to actually make a difference?
Well, you can start with the type of program where you and I are participating in at Google, to look at where can we create a cadence of time set aside with intentionality of developing what could be friendships, right? If someone can't create friendships, fine. If they want to create friendships, fine. But unless we have the context where that can happen, it's not going to happen. So scheduling a time weekly, at least twice a month, once a month. Virtually nobody creates close friendships seeing somebody for an hour or so once a month. to do that, and then to extend invitations with that intention, to understand that it's not task oriented, but that it's a structured time to develop closer relationships and perhaps more empathy and understanding. That's the start. As you know, as you've seen with the program we're doing at Google, there's more to it to really get really powerful. We ritualize it in a very, very light way, but we ritualize it so that that time together is special. Another way to say that is set aside. In spiritual traditions, we call that sacred. It all means the same thing. It just means this time that we're spending together is not like the time I'm shopping or the time that I'm preparing for taxes. It's set aside for us to have a certain kind of relationship. And then to make sure that that time has a host that is protecting that space. That you and I know, when we get together in a small group with the Google Vitality Lab, that if somebody were to barge on and say terribly racist things, for example, they're not going to be there very long, right? And just that knowledge that someone is holding the space makes it a more fertile place for an intimate conversation to arise if and when we want to have that.
So creating that safe space. So if I can, get that, what organizations can be thinking about, and even managers within those organizations with their teams, is creating the cadence, ensuring that there's intentionality behind that regular cadence, ritualizing it, and then having a host to ensure the safe space. I want to just pause here. Chris writes, we think that quantity is more important than quality, transactions rather than relationships. And idea number one, Charles, fabulous book on art of community. And number two, clearing, personal sharing described in sacred communities. So, and then Tatiana writes, do you host these on Zoom? And how do you find the participants in the Google community? So
Great.
We want to address that, and then we'll start to wrap it up.
Right. Well, we can talk about, yes, we host on video call platforms now, just because we needed to. Just know that originally this was not the most powerful way to do it, and we plan to have a cadence of in-person events. The Google program that Laura has referenced is an invitation program by a Google team that's picked people that they want to be in a conversation about how to create a future that Google presumably will be in. And so that's where the invitation happened. And one of the things that makes all communities work is there needs to be a boundary. There needs to be a sense of who is inside, who's outside. And you can make that boundary whatever you want, but the sense that on any given meeting, there's not a wonderment who's invited and not. And so those are invited participants that get on a video platform. And we all expect to, when the pandemic allows, to then have a cadence of shared meals off of Zoom.
Which is something that some of us have already had a chance to do, which I feel so grateful for. So I know that this is really a lot of things that we need to be doing collectively. And we've had a chance to talk about some of the structures that organizations and even teams within organizations can think about doing so that they can start to take more of a collective approach to this. But Charles, going back to that individual who is trying to think about, how do I tackle loneliness in my own life? How do I start to create more community well-being for myself? What would be 3 quick things that you would recommend that the individual think about doing?
Well, I always like starting at the beginning. If a community is a group of people who share mutual concern for one another, we can consider, well, who are the people we care about? And just tell them, if you have an emergency at 3 a.m. and you don't call me and I can help, then that's a problem for me. And what really happens is some percentage of those people will say, well, my goodness, please call me. And then you're acknowledging community that was already there and making it explicit. We've already talked about the fact that we can look at our schedules and, where possible, pick a time. It can be Friday at 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock, or Thursday from 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock. Just pick a time every week where that's where you're investing in building some relationships in your family, in your faith community, in your philanthropy, at work, and know that that's what that's for. And then you can invite others to join you in that time once a week or twice a week, because you've set it aside. And as they show up, because you've made that invitation, you will have built a cadence of relationship building in your life. And I promise you, after a year of that, that's life-changing. And
I can attest to that. So inventory kind of where you're at, schedule a time, invite others to create that cadence. And again, recognizing that this is part of a larger trend Taking some of the blame off of ourselves. So Charles, how do we stay in touch with you?
Well, I have a website. It's my name, charlesvogl.com, charlesvogl.com. And there is a way to contact me there. I think more importantly, there are downloads there that anybody who's in a formal or informal leadership role can download. And it highlights principles that I discuss in my books to open up a conversation, any team that's recognizing we want to create more connection here. And when we go through the downloads and discuss the principles mentioned, it'll start a conversation about how you can incorporate them in a group of people you already care about.
Awesome. So Charles, thank you so much for being my guest today on this LinkedIn Live show about community well-being. I want to thank all of the people who joined us in our conversation today. There are some downloads also that we are making available for managers in particular who want to create an oasis of well-being within their team. And you can also go to charlesvogl.com where you can get some downloads so that you can start to build campfire-like communities within your organization as well. So Charles, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who was part of our conversation today.